My name is Paul Poiker. I'm the archivist here at the Moravian Archives, and I'm so glad to see you here in our reading room. And I'm also glad to see so many people online. We have a lot of people who are following the live stream, and I'm sure because we are recording this event that many more people will watch the recording later on. Now it's my honor and pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Christina Petterson. Dr. Petterson is an independent scholar, and currently she is the scholar in residence at Moravian Theological Seminary just across the street. And we're grateful to the seminary that we can borrow Christina this afternoon to speak to us at the Moravian Archives. Christina studied theology in Copenhagen, Denmark, and holds a PhD from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Christina lives part of the year in the Moravian town of Christiansfeld, Denmark, and part of the year in Newcastle, Australia. She discovered the Moravians when she was teaching at the university at Nuuk in Greenland. And since then, she has spent a lot of time in Moravian archives, especially in the archives in Herrnhut. She has published many books and articles on biblical studies and on the Moravians. And her recent book, Moravian Brethren, in a Time of Transition, analyzes the economy and sociological structure of the Moravians based on a close reading of Zinzendorf's speeches to the choirs. And we have that here in our gift shop. And her most recent book came out the day before she left for Bethlehem, a town on the King's Field. It's an edited volume about Christiansfeld. It's all in Danish, but it's a beautiful book. It feels really, really nice. We're very happy to have a copy here. Unfortunately, we do not have it in our gift shop. Today, Dr. Petterson is going to speak about the Moravian mission in Greenland, its history, its organization, and its end in 1900. Proceed.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming this afternoon, both those here on the traditional territory of the Lenape Nation and those who have joined us online. Oh, there you are. Yep. I would also like to thank the Moravian Archives of Bethlehem for putting this event together. Paul, Tom, Caitlin, Jonathan, Kelly, and Emma have all been involved in setting this up, so I'd like to thank you all very much. And of course, I'd like to thank Moravian Theological Seminary for hosting me as a visiting scholar this semester. I have had an absolutely wonderful time. The Moravian mission to Greenland lasted almost 170 years. It began on the 19th of January, 1733, and ended in the late summer of 1900, when the Moravian missionaries handed over their congregations to the newly established state church and left Greenland. During this extensive period, the Moravian missionaries baptized nearly 10,000 Inuit at 6 mission stations and dozens of outposts. The first 3 decades of their efforts were documented in the first large-scale production of any Moravian mission, David Kranz's History of Greenland, which was translated into a range of languages and whose influence reached far and wide. And yet, in spite of these impressive results, the Moravian mission to Greenland has, with few notable exceptions such as Thea Olstorn and Joanna Kotchik, received very little attention. So this afternoon, I would like to present to you some of the results of my research into the Moravian mission to Greenland in the 18th century. The presentation today is taken from my forthcoming book. There we go. Early Capitalism in Colonial Missions, Moravian Household Economies in the Global 18th Century, which looks at how 3 Moravian missions organized and financed themselves in the 18th century. The Greenlandic mission stands out in that there was no economic development in the Moravian missions there, by which I mean no way of financing its own operations, much less creating a surplus to send back to Herrnhut. In Greenland, we have, in other words, a more or less pure mission, in that the Moravians there could focus on mission and cohabitation with their Inuit congregations. So I'd like to begin with a bit of background. The world's largest island is by the inhabitants themselves called Kalaallit Nunaat, which means land of the Kalaallit. The Danish name is Grønland, which translated into English is Greenland. The term Kalaallit is a more national or local term, whereas the term Inuit is a name for the ethnic group of indigenous people inhabiting Greenland, Labrador, Nunavut, and Quebec. And so I've taken two pictures here on the slide. So the picture one, the one furthest that way, is all ice and sort of is a bit of an odd shape, but I took it along because it shows sort of the context, and it shows Denmark, and then also the proximity to Scandinavia and Labrador and so on. And picture two I took because I like that, but it doesn't have the context, but it does show that it's not all ice, that there are areas of ice-free land, and sort of gives a more realistic representation of habitation. And also a bit more accurate shape, I think. So while Greenland was claimed by the Danish-Norwegian crown in the early 17th century, the actual colonization began in 1721 and took place through a number of separate settlements founded and paid for by a string of privately run trading companies with royal concessions. And there were 4 of these. The first trading company was founded or initiated by the missionary Hans Egede, who so I pronounce it in the Danish way, the English one sounds more like Egede, with the sole purpose to support the missionary efforts. Egede arrived in 1721 along with his family and a motley crew of sailors, merchants, and workers for the settlement, which was initially placed on an island off the mainland, and from 1728 on the mainland itself at Good Hope, today's Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. The Danish colonial settlement at Good Hope thus included both the mission and its economic underpinning, the trade. This was the situation when the Moravians arrived in Greenland in 1733. So, beginning in 1721, 19 settlements had then been established up and down the west coast to keep English and Dutch merchants and whalers at bay. And these settlements were functionally independent centers controlled by merchants and missionaries employed by the trading companies and the missionary board in Copenhagen, respectively. After these 4 trading companies had managed to establish the foundations for a profitable trade in Greenland, the Danish state took over the trade in 1774 and established the Royal Greenlandic Trade, which effectively governed Greenland until 1953, when Greenland was subsumed into the Danish Commonwealth. In 1979, Greenland obtained home rule, which meant control over domestic affairs and an annual grant from Denmark. In 2009, the Home Rule Administration changed to self-rule, which is the first step towards independence from Denmark, in that over time, the administrative branches still run by Denmark, for example, in international affairs, will in time be taken over by the government of Greenland. So that was sort of just a broad overview. The Danish colonization of Greenland then was not settler colonialism, such as the type we find in North America and Australia, but more of merchant colonialism, which is economic exploitation and control. And this was only really in the very beginning when the Moravians arrived, and the Moravians would always find themselves outside this development and indeed subject to colonial control. So I would now like to turn to an overview of the Moravian mission in Greenland. In Denmark, Moravian ideas had been spreading from the late 1720s, but in the early 1730s, the Moravians in Zinzendorf were quickly losing favor due to disturbances and social unrest caused by more radical pietists. It seems that as a way out of this mess, the newly minted king gave the Moravians permission to work in both the Danish colonies in the Caribbean and Greenland, off to the colonies with the troublemakers, and thereby at the same time granting some concessions to Zinzendorf. The mission grew steadily, as you will see on this slide. The pink dots are the Moravian mission stations. The mission stations, they were established at a steady rate in the 18th century. New Herrnhut, and I'm sorry, I should have marked which ones are which, and I know you can't see it, but New Herrnhut in 1733, Lichtenfeld 1758, and Lichtenau in 1774, And then another 3 in the 19th century, Friedrichsthal, 1824, Umanak, 1861, Ichlopaid in 1864. And the reason I've separated the last 2 is that I'm not entirely sure to what extent they are actual mission stations or perhaps very large outposts. They don't have their own church registers, for example, but they do have their own diaries and correspondence. The Danish Lutheran mission followed the trading posts, and thus their mission was focused north of the colony of Godthaab on the midwest coast of Greenland. And so that's the between present-day Nuuk and the Disco Bay, and that's precisely that blue line I've drawn on a bit clumsily there. And that's where most of the Danish missionary efforts were concentrated. The Moravian mission stations, on the other hand, were along the southwestern coast. If you just remember the last slide, they were all moving from Godthaab and down. The Inuit way of life was itinerant in summer, with trade and hunting trips from the south up and from the north down, meeting for various exchanges north of Godthaab. And so the first Inuit to take serious interest in the Moravians came from the south on their way up. And the first baptism, namely that of Qayanak and his family in 1738, was a family from the south coast. And they did not stay in New Herrnhut, but they went back to the south and spread the message of the Moravians there. And so this area became the logical focus. And there is an interesting book that, which to some extent deals with the Moravian mission in southern Greenland in the 19th century. It's called Cultural Encounters at Cape Farewell. And it also makes very good use of many of the ethnographic items from Greenland, which are held in Herrnhut. But it does take a fairly negative view on the Moravians, although I was looking in the English version, which is much more pro-Moravian than the Danish one, which sort of sounds a bit more critical, but I'll have to look into that more in depth, but that surprised me. I now want to turn to the organization of the Moravian mission in Greenland. For the Moravian mission in Greenland, or for the Moravians, the mission in Greenland was a miracle of grace, Wunder der Gnade. The Greenlandic community has over time become a joy to our hearts. No one has particularly harmed them, and it is surely a miracle of grace that the Savior has presented among the heathen congregations, which has also manifested itself in the communal and choir order in all their external aspects, as one can see with one's own eyes in Greenland. And this is how it was described at the First General Synod in Marienborn in 1764, where they were assessing the state of the various missions. The term miracle of grace was due not only to the rapid progress of the mission, but also its organization, because the leadership in Herrnhut were very pleased with the progress and the fact that there were in 1764 2 well-organized mission stations, one in New Herrnhut near the colonial settlement of Godthaab, and one in Lichtenfels, further to the south. At these stations, the missionaries lived all year round, and most of the indigenous congregation during the winter season, which lasted from early October to May. In the diaries, we see that the Inuit congregants start arriving in early October and live in tents while they construct their winter turf houses and move around and move in around mid-October. They begin breaking up around late April and take off in early May for the Capelin gathering in the first half of May. The indigenous congregations lived in winter houses. So first we have, this is the picture from David Krantz, which is, then you see, you see the natural bay with the water, and then there are a number of tents, which is the summer dwellings, and then the winter houses are sort of all around. It's not very clear at all, I'm sorry, but if you ever see this picture, then it actually is a good description of summer and winter put together, because the tents are there and the winter houses are there at the same time. So Scott, that reminds me of some of the stuff you've done on that sort of perspective of everything lumped together. This lithograph by Lars Møller, who was an extremely prolific Greenlandic printer, editor, translator, and artist, born in 1842 and died in 1926. And if you note how the turf house is foregrounded and the mission station, just the brown building there, that's placed in the background, and I really like this picture. And so this shows Moravian Inuit at New Herrnhut. From 1779 to 1783, the single sisters lived in a choir house. And from 1752, a widow's house was built every year. And from 1753, a house for the single brothers. This division of the community into groups of gender and marital status had been a basic structure of Moravian settlements in Europe and here in Bethlehem since 1740s, and served several purposes. And I know that I'm saying things that you all here know. I'm just making sure that we're all on the same page, also people online. At a spiritual level, the groups, the choirs, were pastoral care groups and liturgical fellowships, but also a way of sharing the same experiences from one's particular stage on one's life way. In Europe and Bethlehem, the choir houses were also workplaces. In the single sisters' house, the sisters sewed, wove, spun, tailored, and knitted. In the single brothers' house, there were workshops for watchmaking, wig making, tailoring, weaving, etc. In New Herrnhut in Greenland, the sisters' house was established in 1749. The sister Judith Isek, one of the 5 Inuit who had been visiting Europe, including Scott told me the Prince of Wales, that when they were in England, they met the Prince of Wales. But they had been they traveled to Europe, and I think they also stopped over in Bethlehem. Judith Isek then came back to New Herrnhut and wanted to establish a choir house there. And so that was how the choir house structure began at New Herrnhut. And then, apart from that, Inuit also lived in family houses around the mission settlement. So not everyone lived in choir houses. The pattern of communal living overlapped to some extent with traditional Inuit ways, in that it was regular for extended families and larger groups to live together in order to share maintenance of equipment, hunting together, and the subsequent sharing, consuming, and storage of game during winter. The choirs then came to replace the traditional community structures in hunting, gathering, and fishing, and as such could be seen as an extension of the subsistent shared economy of Inuit. They also followed the seasonal pattern. As in Europe, the choir houses in Greenland served as units of production, but production understood on Inuit terms and bearing the character of subsistence survival. And this is not only evident in that seasonal dwelling pattern, but also in their hunting patterns. And there are many examples of the Inuit brothers going out on seal hunts, and Inuit brothers and sisters going out for amasat or kapelin gathering every year. And also the settlement of New Herrnhut had an Inuit storage house for provisions in winter. And so that's how it sort of came to replace traditional community practices. The question of the choir houses was raised in 1781, the question of abolishing the choir houses, when Michael Königsegger, the missionary, was in Europe and reported on several matters to the Unity Elders Conference. He stated that it was worth contemplating whether to keep or discard the houses, and that the Inuit were disposed to the latter. He further noted that the purpose of the choir houses had not been reached, and that the missionaries had come to realize that since the dispersion of the Inuit brothers and sisters, I'll come back to that in a second, the single brothers and sisters would be better living in the family houses. Königsegger read out an assessment by missionary Jacob Beck. In the choir houses, there is a lack of the necessary supervision. Since the unmarried men could not subsist without the help of the women, they would have to turn to the unmarried sisters or widow's house, which gives rise to some disorders. In the latter especially, there is a gathering of all the unmarried choirs. The young unmarried men lack the necessary lessons in seal trapping in the choir house, and they become poor providers. And the unmarried sisters are also not properly used to work, etc. So here we see the problem with gender segregation in that it interferes with the Inuit way of life and division of labor. It was the woman's task to cleanse the seal, carve up the meat, prepare the skins, the organs, and the intestines that were used for thread. The Inuit single brothers then, as the quote indicates, would turn to the women in the congregation, thus violating the gender segregation. And this segregation also had an effect on the women's labor in that women were not trained to work within this particular relation. The missionaries had employed Inuit women to work for them, cooking and making and repairing clothes, and this was paid for in tobacco. But in terms of Greenlandic subsistence, the choir houses were not ideal, and the effects of this showed up in younger generations who then did not benefit from being taught by the older members of the community in hunting and preparing the game, and thus providing for the community at large. The dispersion, which I mentioned earlier, of the Inuit members refers to a royal decree from 1777, which meant that the Moravians were not allowed to have big congregations set up for winter, but that these needed to be spread out more so that the Inuit could hunt over a large territory and bring in more blubber, which was the main item of interest for the trade. And this had been a push for decades, but not until 1777 did the trade finally manage to get a royal edict through. Heinz Israel, in his book on the Moravian mission, has some very good appendices on this, and this is in German, and it's from 1969, but that is one of the only book-length studies of the Moravian mission in Greenland. So in 1784, the winter settlements were built for the first time without the choir houses, but the communal spirit, which they had helped establish, prevailed. This community spirit was fostered through annual commemorations alongside the daily and weekly events. Twice a week, there was a morning assembly for Inuit, where a national helper, i.e. an Inuk, would speak to the assembly, and every evening, one of the choirs would have their evening blessing. Midweek, there would also be a general assembly led by one of the missionaries, and then, of course, Sunday service. Once a month, communion was held, which also required preparation in the individual speakings that preceded partaking of communion. And then there were the meetings every 2 weeks within the missionary group to ensure that the group ran smoothly. Added to this was a need to procure food, tend the garden and the sheep, bake, hunt, and fish. In particular, hunting and fishing were tasks undertaken by the missionaries with their Inuit brothers. And there are numerous examples in the diaries of the missionaries going fishing or out on land hunts for reindeer and birds. The very close quarters and living conditions within which they lived made community inevitable, even if these did take shape along European Inuit axis. And this is where I want to look at now. Water. One of the monthly events in the settled winter season was the Gemeintag, the community day. On these community days, new members were baptized and admitted into the local community, where letters and liturgical texts had been translated and were read out to the congregation. In the earlier days, there was also communication from Herrnhut to the Inuit congregation and back, letters and notes from the Inuit brothers and sisters to Zinzendorf and his son Christian Renatus, and letters from Rosina Nitschmann and Johannes von Watteville to New Herrnhut. Interestingly, we see that in Greenland, on the Gemeintag, the material read is increasingly material concerning other missions, and more importantly, the people being converted. And so in the period from 1760 to 1765, when these Gemeintag were held every month every month, always on January 6th, Epiphany, which was celebrated as the Heathen Day, 3 to 4 times in spring and 2 to 3 times in winter. On these days, material was translated and read aloud from the Indian diary and the diaries of the Black congregations, letters from Babiche, Saramacca, and Saron in Suriname, letters from Jamaica, letters from Nain in Labrador, and the Danish West Indian missions in St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John, as well as from Antigua. It is thus less a community as such day and much more a native convert day. And while the emphasis on community, the community is increasingly twofold, European and native. In Greenland, this development took place at some time in the 1750s. In the material from the late 40s, there still is mention of letters and translations of liturgical text, whereas the diaries of 1760s include stories from other missions. And I just want to include here as well that the missionaries, because they were always arguing, and there was a lot of strife within the European brothers and sisters, and so they were encouraged to read from the community records, or Gemeindennachrichten. Paul, how do you translate that in English?
Congregational accounts.
Congregational accounts. So they were encouraged to sit and read this by themselves in the evening, and sort of to provide a sort of community feel, and that also helped, I think, just to sort of provide these different groups of fellowship. But this distinction is, of course, a logical outcome of the choir system. And I'll just repeat that, as we know, the choir system was a way of dividing up the community into several subordinated categories, and they were kinship groups and liturgical fellowships, as well as pastoral groups. And the pastoral logic of the choir was to target the individual believer in his or her specific situation and level of faith. The choirs had helpers or workers who helped monitor the spiritual and physical well-being of the choir members, and the members were divided into subgroups called classes, and they were arranged according to spiritual compatibility. Once this structure was transposed onto the missions, it clearly had implications not necessarily imagined, namely the racialized consequences of A, the native convert spiritual development, B, the leadership structure, C, the consequences of the division of the community into Europeans and, in Greenland, Inuit. But at the same time, this segregating choir structure also had an enabling feature in that it promoted indigenous leadership. By the 1760s, the Inuit workers in the communities had been in charge of their own daily gatherings for over 2 decades. In a way akin to the active participation and leadership roles of women in the movement during Zinzendorf's time, it was assumed that the Inuit themselves participated in the liturgical organization and administration of their fellowships. As was the case with female leadership, so also did this change in the years after Zinzendorf's death. In the correspondence from the intermediate inner council to the missionaries in Greenland from 1763, there are several indications of a desire to increase control with and monitoring of the Inuit congregations. Apart from the usual individual assessments of and speaking with the Inuit members before communion and community day, they are now given another assessment task, namely to hold a weekly meeting to assess the spiritual situation of the Inuit members and the workers. Such assessments would also take place in Europe, but at different administrative levels. The procedure towards acceptance into the community would be initiated by the leadership and put towards the lot in Europe. The speakings for communion were dealt with by the leaders of the choirs, and Katie has done lots of work on this. The choir leaders were responsible for this task. The choir workers who had responsibility for monitoring the spiritual welfare of the members would also hold regular meetings to assess the members. This was all in Europe. In Greenland, however, these tasks were all carried out by the missionaries. And so, you know, it adds a difference, racial difference to the structures of the community. Even a European who was not active in the spiritual, but rather the material aspects of the mission, such as managing the household, was still committed to the community as a whole, and his assessment or her assessment would also carry weight. Another request is that while it is truly wonderful that was written in the letters, that the Inuit workers hold meetings and assemblies, the intermediary inner council urged the missionaries to consider whether it would not be both good and necessary if a brother or sister visit these meetings to see how they proceed. There is no indication that this happened, but the diaries from 1760 and onwards give a small summary of the address of the Inuit helper to the congregation. And whether this is to demonstrate the missionaries' presence and the proper content of the address is not to say. It could also be a suggestion from David Krantz, who in the preface to his history of Greenland lamented that the diaries did not include more material from the Inuit members and their participation. In sum, while there was certainly a difference between the European and non-European brothers and sisters in Greenland at many levels, there was nevertheless a very, very close community and a sense of a shared grander purpose as well as everyday survival. I now want to turn to the end of the mission. The difficulties and conflicts with the colonial powers manifested itself in different ways over time. Early on, there were theological conflicts. Later, problems with trade came to the fore, either in terms of transport or, as I mentioned, settlement issues. In the 19th century, nationalist discord began, and it was now the German ancestry of the brothers that became a problem, even if they were Danish. The whole identity of the Moravian brethren as Germans was the issue. Shortly after Denmark's defeat to Prussia in 1864, there were attempts to oust the brothers from Greenland, or the Moravians from Greenland. This failed due to an intervention by the Danish Missionary College, but the mood was far from improving. At the General Synod in 1889, the question was raised whether it was better to abandon the Greenlandic mission, which was not carried through, but the very movement was underway. When the Moravian Church the following year was invited to begin a mission in German East Africa, in present-day Tanzania and Malawi, and to enter into cooperation with a number of national and international mission societies and to receive financial funds earmarked for this purpose, the question then became whether one should stay in Greenland or consider that particular mission to be completed, and instead to look to the eastern side of the African continent. Henrik William, a Danish church historian and pastor who has done most work on the Moravian mission to Greenland, but it's all in Danish, has analyzed the very intricate process of these years in a very long article, and there he dismisses that financial motive played a role. I do think it's important to emphasize that the expenses in Greenland were largely borne by the Moravian community at large, and although the missionaries did not pay for their transportation, there was nevertheless a considerable expense associated with the maintenance and operation of 6 mission stations in the Arctic. Their supplies, the support for members, and whatever else. It was not a cheap endeavor. And the prospect of being able to use funds and workers in new mission fields was probably only as the external occasion, because in the course of the growing colonization in the 1800s, the Moravian congregations had increasingly been made and had made themselves alien elements within the expanding colonial society. They were different in respect to housing, organization, way of life, theology, education, and culture, and therefore it was probably time to give up. It was resolved at the Synod in 1899, I think, and they left Greenland on the 24th of June, 1900. If we now turn to the Moravian mission in Greenland as part of the global Moravian mission, the German historian Gisela Metzler has pointed out that the Moravian Church was a global network maintained by an extensive system of communication. The communication system included diaries, letters, reports, instructions, visitations, celebratory days, watchwords, and community news. This communications network had been part of the Moravian Church from the beginning. Even in the time before Zinzendorf's death in 1760, when there was no formal mission organization, there was a flood of letters to and from Greenland. Diaries sent home every year, lists of members, and questions about all sorts of things. During the 1750s, a few smaller bodies were set up in Herrnhut to try and to get a grip on some of this growing global community. And Zinzendorf's son-in-law, Baron Johannes von Waddeville, was the main correspondent with the missions and thus also with Greenland. Johannes was on a visitation trip to New Herrnhut in 1751 to 1752, and subsequently called himself, with customary affectation, one might say, Johannes Assersok, the one who loves. In the correspondence with the Greenlandic congregation, my Greenlandic student said that the word didn't make any sense at all, but from the sort of root of it, they thought that this was what it was supposed to mean. After Zinzendorf's death, as we know, there was an extensive systematization of the Moravian Church, among other things, its mission economy, which from 1762 was controlled by a committee that was to obtain information about the financial situation of the individual missions and so on. And from here, it was then decided how much should be paid into a common fund called the Mission Diacony, which then distributed the funds for various things, including to pay for stuff in Greenland. The more central the management became, the more streamlined the communication became, but it did not necessarily become less, just less spontaneous. And much of the heartfelt communication between the members of the congregation and the brothers and sisters of Herrnhut waned, and communication between from Europe became more administrative. I now want to show you an example from the instructions. These were, as the term suggests, instructions from the leadership to the brothers in the mission field, and they had been a central feature of the correspondence since 1750, and thus still in Zinzendorf's lifetime. They were based on perusal of submitted material, such as diaries and reports, and thus contained suggestions for improvements, endorsements, encouragement, etc. No topic was apparently too minor to get attention. So in the first paragraph 54, a question has arisen as to whether it will be of any real use to keep chickens, and whether the expenses will not be much greater than the small benefit that accrues to the household, especially because they run around the square, and all the circumstances that arise in this connection that will not be edifying or perhaps even an outrage for the Greenlandic children. Just think about this point. Sorry, that was a bit of a clumsy translation, but I think we get the sense. I just wonder what kind of chickens they had. 55. In the case of the sheep, on the other hand, we consider it a real opportunity, and we hope that the Savior will compensate you for what you lose by not pursuing the reindeer. But we find it inappropriate that they appear so often in the official diaries. You could rather tell us about it in your letters. However, we hope that you go ahead with the matter, and we therefore approve that you try to create meadows, even if you have to pay your Greenlandic sisters 3 to 4 thaler every year for the work of minding these meadows. Also, do not forget to make good use of the wool, even if you initially only process it into stockings for your house. Maybe some of the Greenlanders can learn spinning and knitting. This will also spare the Heiden Diacony an expense. If there were things that could not be sorted out by letter, it could also happen that a visitation was carried out. That is, a person sent by the leadership to come to, for example, Greenland, talk to the missionaries and the congregations, attend meetings, baptize, organize, etc. And the point of this was to create unity with the line laid down in Herrnhut, but also sort of give an outline, outsider's view of the situation in Greenland. So Sternberg came to New Herrnhut and Lichtenfels in 71, and everything was just chaos. And the letters were lying in the cupboard. They hadn't been read since they initially were received, and then they were put right back, and no one did anything. They didn't get on with each other, didn't attend each other's meetings, and so he had quite a task to tidy up and get things in order. However, even if the communication line and tone became more bureaucratic, it actually meant no particular change in Greenland, and I personally think that this is due to the lack of economic development. Missionaries could focus on their mission, and when they needed to obtain food, it was done with members. In this way, there was a close relationship between the missionaries and the congregation. And this is expressed in the diaries, which, although they are official journals that record the passing of days, various events, celebrations, travels, weather, etc., they testify to the close fellowship between missionaries and their congregations. So the last section here is on legacy and, finishing the talk. In her article on emotions and mission history, Australian historian Claire McCliskey, notes that much Danish language research into Greenlandic church history is marked by a predominantly anti-Moravian tone. Much research into the missions to Greenland read the Moravian efforts against the hair, so to speak. And instead, one should, I argue, and there are a few examples of this, really try to find meaning and coherence in the work of the Moravian Church and to evaluate it on its own terms. And while the Moravian mission thus has been downplayed and set aside in Greenlandic church history, its wonderful records live on and can provide an insight into the lives of the Moravian Inuit. In the spring of this year, I was in Nuuk and taught a course on the Moravian mission to Greenland to 3 very enthusiastic students in the Department of Theology. We went to see the building of New Herrnhut, the building on the title page, which today is the official office of the Ombudsman of Greenland. We looked at the church records, all held in Greenland and available online. I mean, the church registers, thank you. We read some chapters from David Kranz's History of Greenland, which I had translated into Danish, and we surveyed the limited scholarship on the mission to Greenland. They worked with some of the hymns of Carl Julius Spindler, a saddle maker from Saxony who was trained as a teacher after joining the Moravian Church. He was a missionary in Greenland from 1864 until 1888, when he had to leave because of his wife's health. In the latest Greenlandic hymnal from 2008, he is the author of 65 hymns, 22 of which he composed himself, and 43 were reworked from a German original. And these are some of the most popular hymns in the Greenlandic church today, without there being a general awareness of their Moravian provenance. While Greenlandic church history does not admit much ground to the Moravians, the areas of history and anthropology have always been much more aware of the role and importance of the Moravians. Christina Petterson from the National Museum of Greenland, who I think is with us online, is finishing a PhD in Arctic archaeology and has been excavating some of the areas around New Herrnhut, providing a much needed corrective to assumptions of abject poverty at the mission station. So even though there is no Moravian congregation in Greenland, the Moravians are there. Initially as mere traces of 168 years of hard work, but once you know where to look, their presence is still a very living one. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, for this wonderful talk on the history of Moravians in Greenland, its beginning, its development, and also its end, and how the Moravian mission continues to live in the memory of people in Greenland. Are there any questions for Christina?
Hi, it was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Christina. I learned a lot, and I can't wait for the book to come out, unless it's come out already.
No, not yet.
All right, so that's great. I was wondering, I mean, your thesis about the construction of choir houses, the actual physical construction of choir houses that then single men and women would live in, disrupting traditional structures of family and work, is very, very interesting. And I was wondering, having been working on the missions that are around the same time here on the North Branch of Susquehanna, whether or not, you know, there's something that I can learn. There's obviously a lot I can learn, but whether or not there's a model that I can think about as there is no structure for a single sisters choir or a single brethren's choir within, for example, the missions that are on the North Branch, right? They do have one house, which is for the widows, but other than that, the family structures are kept very much along traditional Lenape or Mohican lines. And what you read from the diaries of those missions is that traditional hunting, traditional planting, etc., is very successful. And I was wondering if in the other missions that you're comparing the Greenland mission to in your book, you see whether or not the actual construction and relocation, if you like, of single women and men has an equally disruptive role on the sustenance of the community, as you say it does in Greenland. And I have not found within the Native American mission here in Pennsylvania.
So I wonder whether the Greenlandic mission is actually the only mission where it happened, because the other mission that I compare with in the book is the West Indies, and there it was impossible because it was a slave society and the slaves lived by themselves, and so there they had the choir structure but without the choir dwellings, which was how they continued in Greenland until the mid-19th century. And the same in Suriname. I asked Jessica Kronhagen, she said absolutely not, no choirs there. And so and then missions that were established later they didn't have choirs at all. So the later settlement in Greenland, of course, Friedrichsthal, was not built according to choir. And the Australian missions, which were much later, there was nothing there. And so I wonder whether the Greenlandic situation actually is an anomaly. I'm just desperately trying to think whether there are others, but because I had assumed that there were well, maybe it was indigenous members living in white choir houses in Bethlehem or in the North America, but not in the settlements themselves. Okay, yeah.
So within the missions, I may be wrong, but I have, in the missions that I've studied, I have not come up against, or I've not found an edifice. Right, a building. Which is, or a house, which is specifically for a single sisters and a single brethren's choir. Even if there is a single sisters choir as an organization. Right.
That's very interesting. And so that's more the pattern of what it was like in the societies in the capital cities of Europe, where there was a choir sort of structure, but not choir dwelling. And so people would meet in choirs and pray in choirs and so on, but not live according to them.
Anyone else?
Was there any connection with Labrador at all? Any with the missions there, with the Inuit there?
So the mission to Greenland provided a stepping stone for the mission to Labrador, and Thea Ostron has argued this in her work, how David Kranz's book actually was a way of lobbying to the English Parliament to enable the Moravians to work in Labrador, because now they knew the language and the people, they knew everything. So it was just an easy jump across the strait to start work there. So in that sense, there is a connection.
I'm curious about the concept of the subsistence living and how that, I think, I would have to think that almost everywhere the Moravians went in those early years, it was a subsistence kind of living, but maybe not the migratory way that would be required in a Inuit culture, and how that messed with the European Moravian concept of the choir system and the economy and how that all worked. Because clearly this, as you described it, just butt heads with their notion of how this whole economy ought to work.
So the way the communities functioned economically in Europe, they thought, well, you can just do the same in the colonies. So you can just work and as a living and or work for a living. And Craig Atwood was just saying in his class yesterday that one of the first missionaries to Greenland was Christian David was a carpenter, and there are no trees in Greenland, so that was perhaps not the best foresight. But I mean, he did do carpentry work there because the colonies or settlements had to be built, and so he worked at the Danish settlement, and he also helped build the second colonial settlement in Greenland and so on. But they were assuming that way that things worked in Europe could be easily done in the colonies. And of course the West Indies is also a bad example of how that did not work. And that is one place where they did not have subsistence living, but financed things through slavery. But the idea was that they would use their skills to make a living, which was not possible in Greenland, and so that's why they had to live in sort of this subsistence survival mode there. The way the Greenlandic society was built up did not work with the choir houses, and that's why they were abandoned. And the Inuit themselves wanted to stop the choir houses because it didn't work. So they had also just sort of run their course, I guess, because initially people were excited, and it was a lovely community of fellowship and prayer and talking and so on. But then once it comes down to when you see that generations of youngsters haven't been raised to provide for the community, then perhaps that becomes a more pressing issue.
What language were they in? And
was there like communication back and forth to Herrenhood at this point, that they knew that these hymns were being written? And the second question is, what did they do for music? Was this something that indigenous folks took up the sort of Germanic hymn traditions? Did they produce music, or do you know much about how they actually made sounds?
Okay, so music is not my thing, but I do know a couple of things. So the hymns, very early on, they translated Moravian hymns into Greenlandic, and that was sung. And one of the things that the missionaries found early on was that Greenlanders sing very, very well, and have a sort of very sort of sweet voices, and the whole idea of harmony worked extremely well, and still does. So if you go to a Greenlandic church service today, it is Moravian singing, and it is wonderful. And so they did translate hymns early on, because they also realized that music was a way of, you know, touching the soul and so on. And so the music, the hymns, and then the decorations, you know, candles, illuminations, colors. It was just an assault on the senses in every sense of the word, and that really sort of touched the indigenous population. In terms of how they sort of, what instruments and things, they did bring violins and flutes, and there are descriptions in the diary where it says it doesn't sound very nice. That was the missionaries playing the violin and the flute, and they said, well, they tried the best they could, or something like that, which but mainly it was the singing that really was captivating and encouraged. And apparently one of the Moravian tradition was on, I don't know whether it was Christmas Eve or the day before Christmas, was to walk around New Herrenhood and sing Christmas hymns, and also up to the walk around in the Danish colony, and that is something that many people still remember. Even though they don't necessarily connect it with Moravians, then that is something that people remember was done and was very pleasant.
Yeah, I had a question, a simple question. Since they had no trees there, what did they use for firewood? How did
Driftwood.
they keep warm?
Driftwood. So turf, you know, the turf houses were built so that, you know, nothing could come in, and they were also sort of very small with a lot of people, so the body heat would keep each other warm. But then also the burning of fat, and the wood that they would use was driftwood, and there was a lot of driftwood. There were a lot of shipwrecks, and because of the sort of ocean and nature of ships and things, so there was a lot of driftwood. New Herrenhood was built with wood, but that was all sort of prefabricated, sort of IKEA before IKEA. It was a finished built house that was then disassembled and sent by ship to Greenland, and Christian David then came and put it all together.
And my other question was, do they still teach about the Moravians in public schools? Do they mention it?
No.
No?
I got the sense that it was not something, I mean, in the later years, I think it's become of more interest, and perhaps I'm also, because my contacts have mainly been within the Department of Theology, and there it's certainly not talked about. And because the Danish sort of Lutheran Church has sort of established the narrative, and the Moravians have been sort of pushed out of that. But like I said, many of the sort of people in anthropology and history know of the Moravians and of the role that they played, but I don't think that that's something that's taught at school level, but I could be wrong, but I would assume not. So that's a careful answer.
We have questions online. I'll get back to you. We have a question from Jared Burkholder.
Yeah.
Wonderful presentation. Could you say more about what we are learning from recent archaeological work?
Okay, so now I'm just saying what Christina told me, Christina Müller, who I mentioned, who's doing the PhD in Arctic archaeology, and she was telling me that because one of the narratives about how the Moravian mission ended was that, you know, everyone was living in dire poverty at the missions, and it simply wasn't working, and that's why they had to give it up and, you know, the whole Moravian experiment was just failed. But she has done some excavations along with students, and they have found indicators of wealth. I mean, perhaps not sort of lots of wealth, but still, pearls and feathers and things like that would indicate that there actually were people there who were not poor. And so that's become sort of a way of questioning that whole sort of understanding of why the mission finished, and that there perhaps were other reasons for it to fold rather than economic ones. And she also gave me a very impressive tour of the site, because one of the things is that building, of course, has attracted lots of attention. But what you don't see is all the turf houses that the foundations are still visible around, and I couldn't really find a good picture, which is why I didn't bring one. But you can see the sort of squares around where turf houses, the foundations of the turf houses were, and sort of then you see the narrow hall or the narrow entryway, which was also down to keep out the cold. And then the different rooms and where the bench had been, or a small mount where you could sit or sleep and so on. And so and the God's Acre at New Herrnhut is unfortunately not intact anymore, which is a shame, because there's lots of members and missionaries there. But that's sort of just become a sort of a kind of a midden, in a sense, on the one side of the building. So there's more to be done, but now that it's sort of the ombudsman's office and things, it's not sort of a place where, I don't know, it's possible to do that much excavating work. But perhaps if it does become part of a future UNESCO application, there would be more interest in examining that part of it. That's a possibility. Thanks for the question, Jared.
Jerry, I see you had a question.
Yeah, just relates to that. Since that building is there and the others are, at least the remnants are there, how do they, Greenlanders express that as part of their history? And when you say they don't talk much about the Moravians, I mean.
Sorry, I don't think I quite understood what you mean.
Well, the buildings are there.
Yeah.
Do people visit it? Do they look at it? Do they use it? That building, for example, and the buildings around it, the ruins around it. How do they explain that if they don't talk about the Moravians as part of their history?
Yeah, so I think that's a very good point. So that building, so if we take that first, that building used to be the University of Greenland, which is also very interesting. And so I actually taught in one of those rooms when I taught theology. And so it's known as the, as the Moravian mission station, but then it's just sort of, I wonder if I can explain it like in Christiansfeld, where I live, one of my neighbors knows that the buildings are called the brother's house and the sister's house, has absolutely no idea what it means, but it's just that it's called the brother's house and the sister's house, but doesn't connect it to any Moravian thing whatsoever. And I wonder if that's perhaps one of the same things, but that's just pure conjecture. But I think, and this is also something I've been thinking a lot about, whether the Moravian history has also, for some people, been, I don't know, connected to some kind of shame in a sense, because the whole incorporation of the Moravian congregations into the Lutheran congregations meant that, people that had different sense of community and different sense of all kinds of things were regarded as a bit sort of kind of like rabble. And they were all moved to a place in Nuuk, which was where they were settled, and that was a bit dire somehow. And so it was always, they were sort of kind of outcasts, is not a very pleasant term, but I think that's how it was understood in the early 20th century. And so I wonder whether that has then meant that people were a bit quiet about, because people know that their ancestors were baptized by Moravians, but it hasn't been talked about so much. But that, I find that is talked about much more now than it used to be. But maybe that's because I'm now meeting more people who talk about it, and not necessarily, do you know what I mean? I mean, I'm not sure whether this is actually the case, or more because my level of contact with people has changed. But I have talked with some people who explained that thing to me about how they were settled on the outskirts of town. I mean, that is also on the outskirts of town, but on another place on the outskirts of town and sort of, not really incorporated properly.
Scott?
Was the God's Acre used sort of through the life of the mission and then in the 20th century, I guess, sort of disappeared, or did it stop getting used and disappeared over a longer period of time?
I don't know. I simply don't know. So Christina also showed me, so Samuel Kleinschmidt, who was one of the most famous Moravian missionaries who was kicked out of the Moravian church and joined the Danish church and became a sort of very famous linguist and one of the first translator, or the first translator of or published translator of the Greenlandic Bible and grammar. He was, I think Christina told me that he was, no, sorry, but he's buried in the Danish cemetery. And so I suddenly thought maybe she told me he was buried in the Goddesacker first and then moved, but I don't think so. But I think there were two burials. One was celebrated in New Herrnhut and one in the Danish cemetery, because he was sort of claimed by both in a sense. But I don't know whether it just fell into disuse during the life of the congregation. I can't think that it would. I mean, where else would they bury their members? But there certainly is nothing there now. I mean, visible.
I think we have one more question online, and some of that you have already answered.
Okay.
That is, let me scroll back. Doug Denton. I wonder if you can say anything about the current Greenland situation. And you've said a few things already, but is there maybe anything else that you would like to add about how things are in Greenland today?
Well, I think one of the things, because I was just there, as I mentioned, in earlier this year, and I think one of the things that has struck me, and this is not a new thing, and I'm not the only ones pointed out, but I sort of suddenly, it struck me very much that they're different. Some people in Greenland orient themselves more towards a more sort of global Inuit, indigenous First Nations community, and some, because of the effects of colonialism and history, have, Danish relations, have very strong relationships to Denmark. And I found that really interesting that sort of, that was certainly something that I noticed when I was there. And I mean, not that has anything to do with the Moravians, but yeah, that was. And it is a complex situation because it's a very large country with a very small population. So the population of Greenland is just a shade under 60,000 people, and so that's not sort of it's not self-sustainable, especially because they're under restrictions for industrial development. They are still, I think Greenland is still included in Denmark's CO2 allowance, for example, which means that, they cannot develop industries which produce CO2 or too much CO2 and stuff. And then there's also all the restrictions from Greenpeace and things like this that mean that some of the subsistence whaling, sealing, and seal hunting and selling of products related to game is also under severe restrictions. And so it's kind of like, caught between a rock and a hard place, really. Can't do this, can't do that. And so it means relying on tourism, I guess, mainly. And but also the university has really sort of developed and exploded and has opened up many more new lines of or new subjects and topics. They've just opened up to a degree in law, which was new since I was there last, and that's also much more international than it used to be, and so that's certainly a very exciting and positive development. And so,
I think we're coming to an end, but in the chat, Christina, and I think that's the archaeologist that that you mentioned, she commented, yes, Samuel Kleinschmidt was buried at Neuherrenhout, but a few years later, they moved him to the Nook Cemetery.
There you go. Yeah. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you, Christina, for this fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.